51 people participating, and the numbers going up like crazy. So we'll just say hello, and you've bought a ticket, right? So you know why you're here. So I'm Phil Williams. I'm going to be moderating this, and we've got Anthony Horowitz and Don Winslow, and neither really needs an introduction because they've both written some of the best books of modern times, in my view, and I'm never wrong. So, gentlemen, welcome to this seminar for two crime writers and a microphone. And obviously, you know that your proceeds from your tickets have gone to the Trussell Trust. Steve Cavanagh was just telling us that we've raised around £14,000 so far. So well done. That's excellent. And thank you for that, because that will keep a huge number of families in food via food banks, which all of us here wish we wouldn't need in 2020, but we do. So thank you so much on behalf of everybody who's organised it for showing up for this. We've got an hour with these two guys. We could do with like 5 hours in a pub. So what we'll do is I'll rattle on. And if you have a question that you want to put to Anthony or Don, then please do that. If you just hover your finger over your Zoom or whatever, at the bottom where it says participants chat, share screen, record, there's a Q&A button. And if you hit the Q&A, as Asim has already done, then you can get your question in there, and I'll whack as many of your questions through to Anthony and Don as I can in the next hour. So that's what we're going to do. First of all, I should point out to you that we've been hanging out in a virtual green room. But before that, is that the first time, Anthony, that you've had a chance to exchange conversation or meet Don?
I actually met Don. I don't know if you'll remember this, Don, but we met very, very briefly at the London Crime Festival, which I think was last year.
Yeah, I remember it well.
I am very embarrassed about this because I was with, who was I with? I was with Adam Hamdy, and I said, tell me, A, who is this guy, and B, what is his best book? And I didn't know your work at that stage, and he said, well, By the Power of the Dog. So I bought it, and you signed it for me, and I have it downstairs, and it sat downstairs for 6 months. And then at the beginning of the lockdown, I finally said, well, I better read this book. And my lockdown, Don, has been 100% you, because since then, I did The Power of the Dog, I did The Cartel, The Border, Frankie Machine. Here I am at the moment with this one, which I am instantly loving. I'm just loving this one so much. And so I feel both embarrassed and I feel a little bit nervous because honestly, we've been introduced as two crime writers, but I couldn't think of two writers who are more different in what we're doing.
Well, it's a shame you were locked down and given cruel and unusual punishment in solitary confinement. So I apologize to you for that. A lot of people have had to be locked down to read my books, and I'm, in fact, very big in prisons, I'm told.
Don, let me ask you, first of all, your current book is, now I don't want to cause any offense with language, so I'm going to say that it's a compendium of shorter stories. Do you prefer novella? Are you even bothered about the language? And let me ask you
about it at all. No.
That's great. Let me ask you why you decided to go down that route this time rather than one complete story.
Well, as Anthony alluded to, for most of the past 20 years, I've been writing rather long books, sort of literary marathons, if you will, this big drug trilogy that took me 23 years of my life, And that's typically what I like to do. I like running those marathons. But I had ideas for stories that I knew were not novels of the epic length like that, but they were a little bit more substantive than short stories. They were that middle distance. They were, to torture the metaphor, sort of 10Ks. I'd read Stephen King, Jim Harrison, some other folks' novellas and thought, not that I'm in their class, but I'll give that a shot.
Anthony, you're used to the series as well, aren't you? You've written and are still writing so many series. Your next book due in August follows on from Magpie Murders, and we've just had a brand new Alex Rider in April. So that the idea, the concept of the series, is that something you prefer to a standalone?
Well, I think publishers prefer it. That's where I'd begin. I mean, my publishers are very, very keen on me running series because if it's an Alex Rider book or even a Daniel Hawthorne book, there is a built-in audience that will come back to it. And also, of course, for me, it makes life a little bit easier because the more you write about one character, the better you get to know that character and the more you find to write about. So, I've been working on Alex Rider for about the same amount of time that Don has been working on his enormous trilogy. For me, it's been 20 years of my life into those 13 or 14 books. Not quite your word count, Don, even so. But it's been a very rich experience because it's a world in which I can re-immerse myself every time. Every time I start the book, I know where I am. Whereas with a new book, it's a blank sheet of paper.
We've got loads of questions coming through on this Q&A window, so I'll do my best to keep up with as many of those as I can and put those out to you as the session
I'm going to say
progresses.
hello to Ian Rankin, who's just popped up on my screen saying hello. He's paid my dues and everything, he says. Great.
Hello, Ian.
Hopefully I'll be doing one of these with Ian when his next rebus comes out towards the end of the year. Timea, that's Timea, Timea, says, Don, your cartel trilogy centers around drugs. How do you think the current lockdown, socially distanced world is affecting the opioid crisis?
I'm afraid very badly. What we've seen since the lockdowns and the quarantines is a spike in overdoses and overdose deaths due to opioids. There are any number of reasons for that. One is that hospitals haven't been available, and so people haven't been able to go in. Two, people tend to be alone, and so when they overdose, there's nobody there to call for help. But three, and probably the more important issue, is isolation. We know that addiction thrives through isolation. And people, obviously, in this period are terribly isolated. So I'm afraid the news is not good. We had experienced a downturn in that, although other drugs were starting to replace it. Meth was making a big comeback and cocaine making a big comeback. But we have seen, unfortunately, in the last 100 days, a severe spike in opioid deaths.
The same person to you, Anthony, says, Alan Conway, who's central to Magpie Murders and features in Moonflower Murders, you're a fictional writer, notorious for using people he comes across as characters in books. So the question is, how safe are those around you, Anthony?
I do put a lot of people I know into my books, thinly disguised, but always in a sort of a positive way. I mean, it's the only ones that are accepted right now are teachers. All the teachers who taught me in my first school between the ages of 8 and 13 have all appeared in my books, and I've killed every single one of them. They've all had rather violent deaths in my children's books. But I mean, I don't use my books for malicious intent. I mean, that's just a joke. Nobody would recognize them because their names are very, very carefully disguised. So they're not, it's for me. And when you're writing a long book, I don't know if you do this, John, but you need to keep yourself amused and entertained. And sometimes just putting somebody into the book as a character and thinking about them and having a laugh at their expense, as sort of a private joke, just spurs you on in that sort of, when you're reaching your 100,000th word.
Yeah, absolutely. I've done that a lot, and it's really fun to do, and occasionally with a sense of vengeance in the cases of particularly bloody deaths or embarrassing situations.
But you use characters. I mean, some of your characters are very clearly modelled on real politicians and such.
Apparently.
And do you have a danger that you're going to get into trouble legally or whatever? I noticed, in particularly in the last of the Power of the Dog ones, the border. Obviously the president there, it's not a very disguised portrait.
Well, I mean, listen, I used a fictional name for that character, but he used a fictional name for that character when he was signing certain documents, and so turnabout is fair play, I think.
But you're not warned off doing that?
No, not so far. Listen, lawyers have a lot of good billing time on my books. There's usually a squadron that go through them page to page. And I'm asked a lot of questions about it, but so far so good. Yeah, the lawyers are the least of my worries, really.
Don, a couple of people in the chat window wanting to thank you for championing Adrian McKinty and The Chain, which came out middle of last year, and he was, I think it's fair to say, very close to not being able to write and struggling, wasn't he, Adrian, when you championed his book? And a lot of people have noticed that you've done that. And that's something you've done through the Story Factory with your agent, Shane, isn't it? Do you want to just explain a bit about that?
Oh, yeah. Well, listen, I played a very small role in that. I read, email of Adrian's about maybe, leaving this field behind. And I thought that was a shame. A big fan of his and his books. And listen, Adrian didn't need any help or advice from me on how to write, God knows. He already had that. What he needed was a champion like Shane as an agent to get behind him and push it. So my role in this was very, very minor. It's really, really Shane and of course Adrian, with his brilliance.
But have you both been there? I know you have, Don, because we've spoken about it before. How close did you come to actually packing in writing because it just wasn't, you weren't selling?
Oh, several times. I mean, my career has been declared dead any number of times, autopsies, and it's been on the slab and all of that. I wrote a book on a train, going back and forth on my regular job commuting, just to amuse myself, because it's more amusing to write a book on a train than it is to read a book on a train. And that's the book, oddly enough, that allowed me to become a full-time writer. But even after that, I can remember at one point, I'd written Power of the Dog and a couple of other books and had $36 in my checking account.
Wow.
Yeah.
What about you?
Talking about writing a book on a plane, there's a wonderful scene in the film Top Secret, I don't know if you've seen it, where Val Kilmer is actually painting a picture on a train with an oil painting, and it's the view out of the window. When the camera comes around to look at the easel, it's just blurs. It's just a blur of the outside view. I think that's a great joke.
No, people were always, the book was called The Death and Life of Bobby Z, and people were always commenting on the jagged rhythm of it. And it would make me laugh because I'd write a chapter going up, and then when the conductor would say, Union Station, 10 minutes, whatever else was happening, I'd just write the end of that chapter. And I'd do the same coming home, and that was the book.
Well, actually, has your passage been...
yourself in Clenny and what you did for Adrian, because I think that, I think it's one of the great things when senior writers like yourself actually support somebody else. We all do it. I mean, Stephen King has done it as well. And that book, incidentally, really annoyed me, The Chain, because when I read it, I thought, why didn't I have that idea? It is such a great idea for a novel. And it's one of the few books I read where I thought, you idiot, you should have had that idea.
It's a great idea. But don't you find that in sort of our genre, in generally speaking, roughly speaking, the crime and suspense genre, that we tend to be pretty supportive of each other, I think.
One of the things I have noticed in recent years, actually only really in the last year or two, is that there is a real fraternity of crime writers. And actually, I noticed it when I was in London with Adam and when I met you for the first time. And it's a funny thing that here we are, all of us dealing in murder and violence and horrible deaths and nasty people and everything. But actually, as a community, we all seem to be quite normal and pleasant. And I find that really, encouraging and endearing, that sense of fraternity, or sorority, whatever the correct word for it is.
Yeah, someone once asked me, in a sort of a condescending way, if I thought as a crime writer that I lived in a literary ghetto. And I said, absolutely, and I love my neighborhood, and I love my neighbors,
We've lost that. I mean, there was some years ago, there was sort of the journalists would say, that the crime and thriller writing and whodunits and murder mystery are sort of the Cinderella of the industry, that we are the sort of the ones who are overlooked and are sort of slightly less valued. I would have said the opposite is true now, broadly. I'm not talking about my own self now, but in terms of sort of the panoply of writers who are there, it's never seemed to me to be so buoyant as it is now.
Yeah, that's great.
And Anthony, just coming back to that question I asked Don, did you come close to not carrying on as a writer? Did you have those struggles as well?
No, because writing is all I can do. I am a one-trick pony. There is, so if I gave up writing, there is absolutely nothing I could do to live on this planet, because I literally have no other talents or skills. I mean, it was tough going at the start. It took me, I think, 10 kids' books, at a time when no one was really interested in children's books and YA fiction, before I wrote Stormbreaker, the book that would change my life, that one book that was sort of, would explode and would give my, propel my career upwards. That was my 11th book. And I think that in a way, I'm glad of that, because I think, and again, I don't know if Don would agree with this, there are some respects that actually the beginning of a writing career, when you're aspiring and hoping and trying and struggling and things aren't working for you, in retrospect, are in fact some of the most enjoyable times. I mean, it's a cliche that when you get higher up the mountain, the only way is down. And I always worry now, will the next book be that one? But I enjoyed that journey to suddenly getting to Stormbreaker and having a bestseller.
I enjoyed that journey as well. I think the other advantage of it, though, is making your mistakes when very few people are watching.
How many of you, are all your books in print, Don? All your early books, are there?
Yeah.
They are still out
Amazing.
there. I mean,
I think they printed like 8 of my first book, which is why they're so valuable in first edition. I couldn't afford one, but but I think maybe it was sort of merciful that no one was reading them in the early days, because I could work on the craft and hone it.
But I think that is the thing. I think with a writer who has an instant success, a huge hit with their first book, has got a problem of how do you sustain that? I've been writing now and full time for 35 years plus, and I've managed to sustain a career. But if you start huge when you're very, very young, I think it must be quite difficult to keep going for the whole journey of a writer's life.
I suppose it's something I'll never know, because like you, I mean, it was going up in plateaus, and then at every plateau, my career was, quote, over. And then we somehow managed to break through. So,
I should point out, just to remind you, I'm sure you've been told this already, but you can get a 25% discount on Don and Anthony's books via Waterstones if you use the promo code Locked Up. For Don's, it's The Border, and for Anthony, it's his forthcoming Moonflower Murders out August 20th. So if you want to take advantage of that, then you can go on the Waterstones site, find those books from Don Winslow and Anthony Horowitz, and put Locked Up, lowercase, all one word, Locked Up, and then you'll get 25% off those books. A really interesting question here from Helen, Don, for you, who says, clearly you're not a fan of Trump. Could you have written him as a character, or would he have been too unbelievable? So we know you did the kind of character alike in the Border that Anthony referred to, but I think the question is, if you created a Trump fictionally, would people say to you, come on, that's too ridiculous?
The editors would have thrown it out. While I started writing that book, The Border, actually during the Obama administration, because it took, a number of years to write a 700-page book. And as things kept happening, it was hard to keep up with it in terms of writing. And so I'm writing things that are very close to the bone, very close to reality, and almost not believing it myself. And you felt at times that you were crossing the line into satire, into parody, as I often do now when I read the newspapers. So to answer the question, I believe the lady asked, no, I don't think I could have created him. Now, mind you, I knew Donald Trump. I remember him from New York in the 1970s. I've been around Mr. Trump for quite some time. But
when you say you knew him personally?
No, but I'd see him around. I was managing movie theaters and that kind of thing, and he would come in, and it was a semi-big deal. But so to me, his character and all of this is really nothing new. It's just incredibly broadened, and you give that kind of personality power, and it's a terrifying experience.
Have you ever, Anthony, decided to parody or satirize a political character in one of your books?
Actually, a lot of people, I've noticed recently on Twitter, people complain a little bit about how many sort of crooked politicians there are in my Alex Rider books. And in fact, in the last one, I've just written Nightshade. The main political character on that is based fair and square on a particular politician. I'll leave you to read it, Phil, and to work out which one
I'm halfway through it. I'm going to offer a guess at Amber Rudd.
But the political guy there, sort of sitting in the Foreign Office or wherever it is based very much on a politician. Because I'm looking at the present government with probably not quite as much horror as Don is looking at the sort of what is happening in America, but with a certain amount of dismay and worry. And almost the same feeling that you couldn't make this up. Boris Johnson as a character, you couldn't really make him up. From the racist, insults of his journalist years to the bouncing on tightropes and sort of becoming the clown prince to becoming, for God's sake, prime minister at a time like this of all times. It almost is like a sort of a divine joke that at the worst possible time for humanity, with coronavirus and with all the threats coming across from Russia, China, and that side of the world, that we have these two leaders in the West. It is like a sort of kind of black joke. But I'm sure we shouldn't be talking politics in this talk. I mean, In this country, whenever I talk politics, I find myself reading about myself in not a very kindly light the next day. So I should steer very clear of that.
Well, look, I know, something I did want to ask you both, because you both have this in common, is that you both have literary work that has been either adapted for small or big screen. And I wanted to talk to you about that. And we'll kick off with a question from Joe Clark, who says to you, Anthony, Michael Kitchen was so good as Foyle in Foyle's War. Do you have actors in mind when you write characters? And it's a question that Don can take as well in a moment. It's a really interesting question about when you're on the page, are you assuming someone else is someone in your imagination that we know?
When I wrote the first script of Foyle's War, which is again about 17 years ago now, my wife and I, Jill Green was the producer on that show, talked about who we would love, who would be our number one hit for Foyle. And Michael Kitchen was the name we both came up with. And we just saw that the character as written on the page was exactly right for him. And at that time, he hadn't done a long-running series. And we were told that he wouldn't want to do one, but nonetheless, we went and approached him. And then to answer your question, I answered the question for because as soon as he came on board and he was Foyle, the character began to change to his requirements and to his strengths. We used to talk together about that. I'll give you a very good example. Michael, in the very, very early days to me, said, I don't ever want to ask anybody a question. And I said, well, Michael, this is a little bit tricky because the character is a detective and detectives tend to ask questions. And he said, I won't do that. I will talk to people and they will volunteer the information to me. And it was the most brilliant note because it took me away from where were you on the night of and, what is this bloodstain doing on your sleeve type dialogue to just more dialogue which tripped people up. It was a brilliant character note. And that was how the character evolved. It was talking to Michael and working with him. And the two of us were equally responsible for Foyle.
What about you, Don?
Yeah, I'll get to that. It's so interesting you say that, though, Anthony. Just this morning, I was working on a scene with a lawyer talking about detectives asking questions. And he's telling his client, never answer a question that isn't asked, because that's really where you go down the primrose path into trouble, I never have actors in mind when I'm writing. Now, listen, I don't want to be disingenuous. Most of my stuff has been optioned or bought for film or television over the years, so I know that that's a real possibility. But if I have an actor in mind, only bad things can happen, really. I'll end up writing a bad novel or a bad film treatment, So I really deliberately kind of set that aside while I'm writing a book.
Was it The Force that James Mangold's doing?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And how's that gone? Because obviously everything's locked down now. What stage does that get to?
It's I guess moving along, but as you say, everything's locked down right now, but he's developing that and some other things. So I think it's going well. I know scripts have been written and, very pleased about it.
Do you stay close to the production process, Don? Do you actually do set visits? Do you go into the writer's room? Do you,
Rarely. I have done set visits, but, I think that the novelist is sort of the vestigial bone on the body cinema. I think that we're not all that necessary. We're like that sixth toe. It can be kind of fun to go to a set, but for a few hours, I loiter around the craft service table and eat. No, I'm being a bit coy. I am in pretty constant touch with the producers and the writers. And we talk a lot, and I think that's been really useful and a very positive thing.
It's obviously slightly different for you, Anthony, isn't it? Because you are also a screenwriter.
I do write my own screenplays, but even so, I don't often go to the set because actually the writer is the one. A set is a funny place. You've got 60 or 70 people, and it doesn't look as if anybody's doing anything, but actually they are all very busy. And the only, as you correctly say, Don, the only sixth toe on the set is the writer. My work is over, and I always find there's a certain mistrust between the actors and the screenwriter if I'm there. It's as if I'm there to judge them, where actually they want to say to me, come on, your work is done now. We're taking your words and we're interpreting them and we're doing it our way, which of course is exactly right. But again, I find a certain tension about being there. Plus, for some reason, if a mobile phone goes off on a set, it's always mine. And if anybody steps in front of the camera, it's always me. So...
is what the big thrill is about having a film or television series made And I'm surprised it didn't occur to me. I'm embarrassed until I saw the first one and I was looking at the credits. And then it hit me, like 2 or 3 years previously, I had this small idea early in the morning. I'm sitting at my laptop and I start typing. And now several hundred people have jobs. They're paying.
I've been there, that's for sure.
And
I was on the set of Stormbreaker, the movie they made out of Alex Rider. And I'm sitting there and I'm standing on a hillside and there are 2 helicopters, one with a camera chasing the other one. There's a stuntman hanging upside down from the first helicopter, a car speeding with more cameras following. And I'm looking around and saying, all of this, all these people started with me on my own in a room, just thinking of this idea. And there's no feeling quite like it. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's a real kick, and that people are paying their bills and, tuitions and that kind of thing. That is, to me, the biggest thrill of it. And also when you hear an actor say one of your lines and make it better than it was on the page.
Oh, I like that too. I love it when actors find something in a line that you hadn't seen yourself.
Right.
Michael did that all the time. And that was great.
Yeah, that's really a thrill.
Another writer who I really admire and like, I just saw popped on my screen. I'm going to say hi to Sherry Lapina as well, who's just joined us. Another writer I happen to know in America. Sorry.
No worries. Hello.
Ian Rankin says, Phil, I can't be bothered repeating my question. Can you scroll down the chat and find it? And then the answer is, only because you give me so much pleasure with your books can I be bothered to scroll down this chat to find your question. So from Ian Rankin for Don Winslow, you're waging a crusade against the current White House incumbent. Can the novel change or affect the political landscape?
To some extent, I think it can. And the only reason I say that is because of some of the reactions that I've had. After the cartel and the border, I heard from a lot of police departments. Didn't hear from any politicians, but I heard from cops. And one of them said, I can't repeat the language that he used on me, but he said, you're just the kind of liberal blah, blah, blah that I thought you'd be. But I think you have some interesting ideas. Can we talk? And now they have a treatment center in their jail. So I think that we can have a limited effect. I wouldn't overestimate it. And my primary responsibility is to entertain and to interest people. But I also think sometimes that when we write about these issues, we can show them to people in maybe ways that they hadn't thought of or hadn't seen, or personalize them so they don't see just headlines. They don't see illegal immigrant. They see one kid's experience. They don't see opioid epidemic. They see one addict's experience. And I think maybe that might have some impact, I hope.
I did think your story, if I may say, the story of, I'm so bad on names, is it Flor and Nick, the 2 little children who come in on the La Bestia and come into America as illegal immigrants? I thought that was unbelievably well told. I'd love even to know how you got inside that world so well, because it's talking about bringing to life something, a story that is in the news and humanizing what is simply statistics and figures in the American press. How did you even find what goes on in those buildings?
Well, it was a lot of reading of journalism, a lot of reading of books, and then talking to people, people who work with these kids, people who defend them in court, and getting stories, and then trying to see it from the inside out as opposed to the outside in. How would I feel? What might I be thinking? What might the child version of me have been thinking, in that situation?
Well, if you're talking about humanizing stories and trying to make them real for people, that for me was one of the most extraordinary strands of those books, just those 2 kids.
Very kind, Anthony. Thank you.
No, I just loved it.
Anthony, a couple of people are asking about whether there's any pressure for you when you've followed in the well-known footsteps of Fleming and Arthur Conan Doyle. I'm sure everyone's aware that you've done an original Sherlock Holmes story and 2 Bonds, and we're very much hoping for a 3rd Bond, aren't we? I am. I keep nagging you about it.
So am I. I'm sort of hopeful that it'll happen.
So how do you feel about the pressure of recreating those characters when they're held in such high affection, but giving us an original story?
Well, first of all, I have a certain misgiving about doing these books, what are called continuity novels. So I wonder if they're not sort of a slightly cynical exercise in sort of selling books. But I can't resist doing it because Bond and Sherlock Holmes are two of the greatest loves in my life. They were hugely influential during my slightly unhappy childhood. The Bond books and the Bond films and also the Sherlock Holmes stories were my escape from reality. And the greatest thing about writing those books is that it allows me to immerse myself completely, to move in, if you like, into 221B Baker Street with the two greatest friends in world literature, Sherlock Holmes and Watson. That's the secret of those books, the friendship. Or in the case of Bond, to be actually there in the office, sitting next to M when Bond is getting his briefing, to sort of be inside the books. I don't really have a concern about it because, I only do it because I love it. And my first duty in those books is not to screw it up for the real fans. All over the world, there are fans of those books. There are real clubs and there are people who are passionate about them. And I don't want to write a single word that will raise an eyebrow. Hey, Bond would never say that, or Sherlock Holmes would never do that, or you're not playing fair with us, or, I'll give you a good example. I could give Sherlock Holmes a romantic interest. It's the obvious thing to do in a modern novel, to have some young person turn up at his... but we know from Scandal in Bohemia, but for him, there was only Irene Adler. And Doyle says that. So you cannot break faith by doing that. You have to absolutely obey what those authors would have wanted. So I'm living inside their world. And the only challenge for me is to raise my game to be half as good as they were, because both of those writers were brilliant. That.
Would you do it, Don?
I have done it. I did it with a book called Satori, following a very famous book, Shibumi. I have great admiration for Anthony in this regard. I found it to be one of the most difficult things that I ever did, was to, same thing, try to write Trevanian while maintaining, some sort of originality, but not offending his loyal and faithful readers. The family actually asked me to take it on, and I did. I don't know that I'd do it again. It's interesting, Anthony. I also would sit in my room as a kid with the collected stories of Sherlock Holmes as kind of my escape.
Oh, it's lovely to hear that. For me, I was brought up in a very, very boring suburb of London, a place called Stanmore, which is on the edge of London. It's the last line on the subway. And it was a sort of boring childhood, wealthy and privileged, so I can't complain too much, but it was nonetheless dull. And when I read Sherlock Holmes, one of the great things about those stories is they are set in the most boring suburbs in London. Norwood and Croydon may not mean anything to you. I don't know if you've visited them, but they are not interesting places. And I loved as a kid the idea that a temple in Agra or a secret society of Mormons somewhere in Utah their tentacles could spread out even to the dull suburb where I was living. That was the attraction of it for me. And I reveled in those books. I just lost myself. I always say I started to write in a way because of Fleming, and I wrote crime because of Doyle.
Yeah, and I would sit in my room reading Doyle and Shakespeare. And I still maintain that Shakespeare might be the first crime writer in terms of Henry IV.
It's funny you should say that, because in Moonflower Murders, I use Othello as one of the main clues. And of course, Agatha Christie regularly visited Shakespeare and twisted his stories. And at the end of Moonflower, I've just done for Waterstones an extra short story, which is sort of extra material for them to have a special edition. And it's all, I won't say which Shakespeare play because it'll spoil it, but it's all about a Shakespeare play and it's how a play seen the right way can become a murder story.
I can't wait. And Henry IV, The Godfather is a retelling of Henry IV with the moral poles reversed. It's exactly the same story. Al Pacino is the young Prince Hal. And while I would confess that Diane Keaton makes an odd Falstaff, that is a character that she's
I haven't seen that coming.
And they end the same way. I do not know the old man, and the door shuts, So I can remember so much as a kid just being up in my room and being able to escape, very geek-like through reading Shakespeare, but then also with Doyle. And I'll never forget the first time I came to London, and I was just so thrilled to be in that setting.
Here's an interesting question for you both from Alex Hawley on the Q&A window. If you've got a question for us, you've got about 26 minutes to get it in. And there's a Q&A button. If you just hover your finger on your Zoom, you'll find it at the bottom alongside share screen, chat and participants. Drop a question there into the Q&A for me and I'll put it to the two authors for you. Alex says, I know you've written in many different forms, both of you. but after listening to an audiobook version of your work, has it changed anything? So your view on audiobooks. Anthony, you want to go first?
I have a terrible confession to make, which is I have never listened to any of the audiobooks of my books. I listened to some of it, obviously, the first chapter, and when I'm meeting the actor, I do it. But, the reason I don't listen to it is I'm terrified I'm going to hear something I don't like.
Right.
By which I don't mean the performance, I mean what I've written. And I'm just scared of hearing my own work read back to me. So I haven't really listened to any of them. I say, listen to the actors. And Rory Kinnear, incidentally, who has done the 2 Hawthorne books, does a brilliant job. I've listened to 2 or 3 chapters of those books just for the pleasure of hearing him do, amongst other things, me, because I'm a character in the book. So I hear Rory Kinnear acting as me, which is quite odd. But I haven't actually listened to the whole one cover to cover ever.
Don?
I haven't either. Roy Porter is brilliant and wonderful, does most of my books, and I will listen to a chapter or 2. But I'll also make a confession. I hate being read to. I have since I was a little kid. Yeah. My mother or dad would come in to read to me, and I really would rather just read to myself. So it's just not my thing, but Roy's been brilliant with it, as have other people in other languages. And also, I've spent months and years with those books. It's the last thing I would do in my spare time is to listen to my stuff. I'd rather, if I'm going to listen to a book, it's going to be someone else's.
But you both must get involved, Don, with the casting of the person that's reading the book, or not?
Yeah. They will send me tapes, and I'll listen, and I'll put my 2 cents in. Yeah.
Anthony, same for you.
My publishers always ask me what I think and then ignore what I say. So that's where I am.
Diane's listening and watching to us right now. She said, I'm listening to The Power of the Dog right now. The narrator is awesome.
It's great.
Kirsty, I hate being read to as well, Dan. I think it's because reading is quicker than talking. So I just want to get on with it. How do you feel I'm being read to, Anthony?
I am a bit like Don. I mean, I love the act of reading. And by that, I mean not just sort of the deciphering of the words and the imagining of the story and taking it at my own pace rather than somebody else's. I love the physicality of books. I love their covers. I love turning pages. I love the feel of the paper in my hands. I love that process. I always say, but in a funny, that really reading is in its own way as creative as writing. They are 2 sides of the same coin. And when you are reading for yourself, I mean, I'm not descrying, my audiobooks or people who enjoy them, but just speaking personally for me, the act of creativity that is me reading a book and imagining the voices for myself and creating it at my pace is a terrific experience. So I prefer that to audio.
I've spoken to a couple of writers for my podcast, which I'll get a cheeky little plug in for, which is Bestsellers. And both Mike Connolly and Lisa Jewell told me that in lockdown, they've really struggled to read. They've been so stressed that they've struggled to concentrate on the act of reading. Have either of you experienced a similar difficulty? Don, you first?
No, it's been a salvation, We live on an old ranch outside of San Diego, California, obviously way out in the country. And during the lockdown, it's been one of my great joys just to go outside and sit, again, as Anthony said, physically with a book. I love the smell of it. I like carrying it around. I like to see it on the table outside. So no, I would say almost to the contrary. I've been able to read, and it's been great.
Anthony? Well, I've already said that I've read 3,000 pages of Don, so that was just a joy. And I've also read some, Golden Age mysteries that I wanted to catch up with. I mean, John Dixon Carr and Josephine Tay. I mean, I always have a pile on my bedside table or on my desk of books that I have to get through, and it takes me sometimes months and months to reach the ones that I want to read and which I love. And that has been the best thing about now. One of the things I've done incidentally is I've stopped reading the news. I've become so disenchanted with both the reporting of the news and the events that are happening in the world that instead of reading the newspaper for half an hour every morning, I'm reading books for an hour. And I tell you something, when I get out of bed, I feel so much happier and so much more ready to take on the day than I did before. And that's something that I'm not going to change.
Anne Griffiths says, now, what's really interesting about this question I'm about to put to you, I did one of these viral Zoom things with Michael Connolly and John Grisham, and we got exactly the same question, which fascinates me, because the question is about whether you two would be willing to create a supergroup. In other words, would you write a novel together, co-authored? Anthony?
Absolutely not. I think that, I began by saying, but I think that although Don and I might, I'd be privileged to be in the same label as Don, a crime writer, I think what we're doing is 1,000 miles apart, really. And I think that if we were to come together, I think it would be a catastrophe of the first order. I mean, not just the book that was written as a result of it, but whether either of us would survive the encounter. I don't know, Don, what do you think?
Anthony, I'm deeply hurt. I don't know how to go on from here with the rest of this session.
If you work it out, that was a compliment in there somewhere.
I was ready to sign.
John, what would the book be? Come on, a book written by you and me together. I mean, for a start, would it be a whodunit? I mean, that's ridiculous. And I can't write like you, or sort of, this.
I can't write like you.
Of your writing, I'm golden age crime and sort of, cheerful, pleasant people living in English villages getting killed. I mean, occasionally.
I am well known for being cheerful and pleasant.
But your books do have. I mean,
my books have a little edge.
Well, a little edge, for heaven's sake. I mean, they're like pile drivers with edge.
I'm going to pick up the gauntlet here. I think we should try it. I think let's get together on some island somewhere. And give it a shot.
I'm heading
3 hours a day.
I'm heading to Crete in a couple of weeks' time, where I sort of spend most of the summer. So that if you want an island, there's the island. And listen, it would be to work with someone of your like you, Don, would be thrilling and scary. Although I will say this, I have actually never collaborated ever with anybody in television or in my books for all the time I've been writing. And the only person I work with sort of day to day is my wife Jill, and she gives as good as she gets. I mean, it's quite aggressive, fractious. But we've been married 35 years, so we cope with each other.
Well, I've been married 35 years.
Good at collaboration. I find it hard. And I would have thought you've got such a distinctive voice. Have you collaborated? I
have on a nonfiction book. Collaborated with a terrific historian named Pete Maslowski, and it worked out really well. I'm impressed that you've been married 35 years and she's your producer. That's extraordinary.
Yeah, she's only been my producer for 25 of them, so the first 10 were the easy ones.
Yeah. But anyway, Anthony, I'm ready anytime you are.
I'll take you up on it, Don.
You have my number, and I don't know if it's Crete or Kauai, but somewhere we'll do it.
I'm just going to throw this out there, right? My idea is that Hawthorne and fictional Anthony from Word is Murder and Sentence is Murder are tasked with investigating and infiltrating the cocaine supply line into the United Kingdom, and that brings Don's expertise in at that point. What do you reckon? That's the story.
Well, since you mentioned it, Phil, I mean, that is something I do, which is in the Hawthorne novels, real characters turn up. So, for example, in that little story that I mentioned, which is the extra material for the book, Sophie Hannah, who is a writer I particularly like, a murder mystery writer, turns up as a character. And, Spielberg has been a character in my books, and Peter Jackson, because I worked with them years ago, has turned up too. And I do love inserting real people into the books. I'm very interested in that sort of breaking that fourth wall between the world of fiction and the world of the reality of the person reading the book. And I love doing that. And so the chances of Don turning up in a book as a character, I would have said, whether we work on something together or not, I would say are pretty high.
I'd be so flattered. Yeah, please do that anytime.
A number of people have asked, so I think it's only fair to put this question to you. I know you must get it a lot, but clearly there's a lot of people watching you both tonight that want your advice. And so the question is, what advice can you impart to someone who has an idea for a debut novel, but they're terrified to sit down and start writing it? Don, you go first.
Boy, well, I can tell you I was there, I thought about writing my first book for years, and I lacked the confidence to do it. And then I heard Joe Wambaugh say in a radio interview, the great American police writer, that when he was a cop and wanted to be a writer, he decided to write 10 pages a day, no matter what. And I said to myself, I can't do 10, but I can do 5, no matter what. And I know this sounds glib, and I do not mean it to sound glib. Writers write. Before it's a noun, it's a verb. And if you write a page a day, if you can just carve out a time to write a page a day, in a year you have a book, you know? And the other thing I'd say while I'm preaching, and I'd love to hear Anthony's response to this, is look, if you sit down and you do that, if you do that on a fairly regular basis and you struggle with what used to be the empty page and is now the empty screen, you are a writer. Don't ever let anybody tell you that you are not. You might not be an author yet, but you are a writer. And as a writer, you're my colleague, and you have my absolute respect. Anthony?
I just want to say I totally agree with everything you've said there, Don. I think that especially in the idea, I get quite agitated about people who talk about being a writer or becoming a writer. And you don't become a writer, you just, as you so correctly said, you write. The moment you pick up a pen, you are a writer. And you have to believe that you are the equal of everybody, because nobody knows. You know, that's the famous William Goldman saying, nobody knows anything. Nobody knows where the next great book is being written. And it can be Don's book, it could be me, it could be anybody, it could be you. And that self-belief is what has to motor you through. And that fear of failure, I so know it too. I'll just tell you that when I wrote my very, very first adult novel, and I was only 20 years old, I sent it to a publisher who gave it to a reader. The reader read a comment, wrote a report, and by accident, the report came back to me. It wasn't meant to be sent to me, it was meant to be sent to the publisher, but I got it. And I opened this envelope and it said, and I quote, and 30, 40 years later, I can remember the word for word. This book worried me, not because it is poorly written rubbish, which it is, but because of the enormous amount of violence and cruelty. It is obvious from the outset that the central character is a dangerous, homicidal psychopath. What exercises my mind is the author too? And that's what I read. I was 20 years old, and this is my first adult novel, and that was crucifying. And it knocked me out for maybe a week before I started on my next book, because self-belief and the knowledge that the world is wrong and you are right is the only thing that keeps us going.
I could not agree more, Anthony. You know, when I was getting rejection slips for my first novel, and I think it was turned down by the first 15 publishers, including the one I'm with now, I was writing the second one in that series, and I had to take the rather insane opinion that everyone else in the world was wrong and I was right.
But that never leaves you, because I don't know about you, but even now, I'm always afraid the next book, is it the one that's going to, the world will find out that I was no good all along, but I've been somehow faking it. And I think every writer I've ever spoken to has that fear. It just goes with the territory, but you can't let the fear stop you. You've got to fight through it and finish the book.
Yep. Just type.
Yeah.
Paul wants to know, are you plotters, the pair of you, or do you write as you go? And just for a bit of context on this from my own background, Lee Child famously tells me every time I speak to him that he doesn't plot because if he were to know how the book would end, he'd get bored writing it. William Boyd, on the other hand, spends 18 months per novel just plotting and planning, and then starts the writing process. Anthony, you kick off on this. Which are you?
When I'm writing quite complicated murder mysteries, like Magpie Murders, Moonflower Murders, very long, complicated books which have lots of clues and lots of characters and books within books and things, I have to plan it. I have to have a roadmap of the book. And I always, my analogy is this. If you visit a city you don't know, you need a map, and that for me is the structure. But that doesn't mean you are tied down to going one way. A map allows you to explore every single avenue and always know where you are. So for me, a structure is vital, but I can surprise myself. I don't follow it from A to Z. I go in all sorts of different directions, and sometimes I can get completely lost and have new ideas, but I've got my map so I can come back to it. That's how I work. I spend a lot of time structuring before I start writing.
I don't. I just sort of pull out of the driveway and go, you know. Now, that's a little disingenuous because in the case of like the big drug trilogy, which is almost historical fiction in some ways, I know the major events. Do you know what I mean? I know the touchstones that I have to hit to make the story real and to make it make sense. to the reader. So I know that roughly I'm going from A to B to C to D. In my other stuff, though, for instance, this most recent book, Broken, the 6 novellas, I had no clue. I would just start with an opening sentence and keep typing, and then make a lot of mistakes and go back and hit delete and then try it again. You know?
You see, that's so surprising that you say that, because only just like 2 days ago, I read so far my favorite story in the book. I mean, I've loved them all, but the San Diego Zoo, which I thought was a masterpiece of construction. I was going to say to you, but if I was going to give young people an object lesson on how to plan a perfect short story that has everything in its correct place and a through line that makes complete sense with surprises coming from everything, that is it. And you're telling me that you just had the idea of a monkey with a gun and that was it?
Pretty much. I'm sorry.
It really pisses me off, Don. That really annoys me. It's totally not doing so well.
I had that line running in my brain for years, you know, about nobody knows how the chimp got the revolver, something like that. And I finally sat down and I thought, okay, how did the chimp get the revolver? I don't know. And I didn't know until the last few pages of that story.
So just for example, when you wove, I don't want to give anything away here, but when you wove 2 superheroes into that book story, did you know that you were going to use them in the way you did?
No.
So that last sequence was just sort of, it's Thursday evening, what should I do now? Let's go to the bridge. I'm shocked.
I'm sorry, Anthony. I'm ashamed.
It's a wonderful story.
I feel I've let you down.
It's a wonderful story. It's a wonderful story, but I will not now be recommending kids to study it, to work out structure. I'll just read this to know how to, that you can do it. I'm not sure many others will be able to, but still.
I was just typing. I'm so sorry.
Well, I should explain, this is in Broken, which is Don's collection of novellas. And the story that the two are referring to is that police are called San Diego Zoo, where a chimp has taken somebody hostage with a gun. That's all you need to know, isn't it, Don? There's no more than that.
That's all I knew.
Well, I approached that story with trepidation. I thought to myself, how can you write a 60-page story about a chimp with a gun? I mean, is this whole thing going to be a sort of, a hostage standoff with one character and a tree? And then it goes in, as I say, it goes in this extraordinary direction, but it's an object lesson. Yeah.
Here's a great question from Julie, who says, I want to make a confession. And listen, Julie, you're in the trust tree. It's fine, right? Whilst I'm aware of both of these writers you're talking to, I've never read either of them. So which of their own books would they tell me to dive into first? Anthony.
Well, without knowing very much about Julie, that's a difficult question, including her age. If she's young, then maybe Alex Rider. If not quite so young, then perhaps, I don't know, a murder mystery, Magpie Murders maybe is fun. Or how about The Word is Murder? Because that's a sort of a nice, light, fun book, not too long, not too expensive to buy, and you can get through it quite quickly.
Don?
Yeah, again, without knowing the person in question, it's hard to recommend a book. But why don't you start with my first one, A Cool Breeze on the Underground, and then read the other 20 in order that they were as long as we're all locked down and being punished.
Showing no mercy, Don, straight in there. Buy them all, hit up the back catalogue.
Just go to the back and start all the way through.
Jenny on the chat says, Don Winslow is my new crush, which might come as alarming news to the owner of the pair of legs over your right shoulder.
Well, we had this conversation in the green room. I'm pretty sure the pair of legs you might be seeing belong to my wife. I'm fond of them as I am of her. So, but thank you. I don't know that I've ever been anyone's crush.
There you go. It's the first time for everything.
Yeah. It's a little late, but thanks.
Anthony, we've got about 6 minutes left. So what I want to do is, Don, I know we've spoken about Broken already, and it's a compendium of stories, and that is out now. Your next book is out in August. And funnily enough, Kevin has asked in the chat if what plans you have for the Alan Conway Atticus pun series. Well, Moonflower is that.
It is. next year, and the producers were desperate for there to be 2 books. My publishers really liked the book, particularly as the central character is not a detective but an editor, and a woman as well. And they really liked the fact that I was writing with that voice. It seemed to work. So they asked me to do a sequel to Magpie Murders, which sort of came into my head. I read it as a standalone. I mean, I know that Don did the same with Power of the Dog. When you wrote that book, as I understand it, you'd never thought of it, or did you, as the first part of the trilogy? No, it was a one-off, and then the 2 extraordinary books follow. So yeah, I mean, the idea came for a sequel with Susan in Greece, running a hotel, approached by a couple. Their daughter thinks that she knows who'd committed a murder. The daughter has disappeared, and the last thing she did was to read a book that Susan edited. So the solution to the murder, a modern murder, is contained in a fictitious book edited by my hero, which is a very, very short, or an attempt to try and sell it in a very short way, because it is sort of complicated, but it's a book within a book, as was Magpie Murders.
Yeah. And can you tell us what you're both writing at the moment, even if you don't want to give too much away, just a broad theme of what you're both writing at the moment, Don?
I don't want to give too much away. I'm writing several different things, which is unfortunately my sort of ADD habit. I write 2 or 3 books at a time. Yeah, I think this morning I was working on a crime book. I'm not quite ready to talk about yet.
Sure. But in terms of timetables, when we might see that, is that next year or is it longer?
Probably a little longer, probably a year or so. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And what about you, Anthony?
I have 2 books on the go at the moment. The first one is the next one in my Daniel Hawthorne series, in which I am a character. So it's book 3 in that, which I have to write this year and probably deliver it around about sort of early spring of next year. And I'm also co-authoring a book with a very well-known American writer, which we're going to be starting on that pretty soon as well.
Did you just...
That's you, Don. I'm talking about you.
I was about to be so offended.
Yeah, that is you.
We'll see you in Crete.
I hope so.
All right.
Does it, the writing process for both of you and the promotional process, is it odd when you are, I know this is a slightly different and much freer affair that we're doing tonight, but is it odd when you have to promote a book and you're writing the next one, and the book that you're promoting, you've probably finished anywhere between, say, 3 and 6 months ago? Anthony, you first.
No, I mean, the promotion is now a very, when I started out as a writer, it was much less so. But now it seems that the whole business of talking to often very large crowds, I've talked in my time to, 1,000 people in a room. And it seems to me actually almost unfair now, but to be a successful modern writer, you've got to be able to perform. I mean, if I had a stammer, if I was nervous, if I didn't perform well in public, I feel it would be very difficult for the sort of, the aftermath of the book. But no, I mean, I feel that the promotion of the book and it's 2 things actually. It's important for the sales of the book, but it's also a pleasure, because don't forget, the whole writing of the book, I'm alone. I'm in a room by myself. Now is the opportunity to actually talk to people, to see the readers, to get the feedback, and I love doing it. So promotion is something I actually very much enjoy.
Don?
Is it me? Yeah. It's, listen, Anthony's had 1,000 people in a room. I've had as many as 0.
I've done that too, Don. I've been to that same room.
One time where the bookstore owner left halfway through the session and asked me to lock up, which I did. But no, I feel the same. That's the truth.
Oh my God.
I feel the same way that Anthony does. It's when I and we can't do it now, which is a shame. But when I go out there, I know that without those people, I don't have this job that I love. Without those bookstore owners, without those readers, I'm doing something completely different in life, And so it's nice to be able to meet them in person, to say thank you, to support them, to share some time and space with them is just fun.
For what it's worth, every single writer has had the empty room. Every single writer has had the short autograph line. And we've all learned that if you've got 3 people queuing for your book and the guy next to you has got 30, you write the longest message you can in the book so that you keep them there for longer. But I have also flown 3 hours, stayed overnight, gone on a 4-hour car journey to a Borders in America, where in a room with 80 seats, there are 2 kids sitting there in a room by themselves. And the saddest thing is they were looking at each other and saying, why does nobody else like this author? We're the only 2 people in the world. So I bought them both a chocolate. I took them out of the room and bought them both a chocolate milkshake, and we sat and had our talk in the coffee bar, and that was a good session too. They always.
Yeah, if there's one or two people there, you have a great conversation, and
in some ways, the smaller numbers are where you have the most interesting interactions and give the best talks.
There was one time an elderly lady came up to me. I'd been sitting there for 2 hours with no one approaching. And she looked at the name tag and she looks at me, and that like they do, like you're in a zoo, the name tag and me. And she says, "Are you Don Winslow?" Yes, ma'am, I am. "May I ask you a question?" Yes. She says, "Do you know where the ladies' room is?"
Yeah.
And I did, and I told her, so it was fun.
I'm going to sneak a couple more in before we have to say goodbye, because everybody's having such a lovely time in the chat window. So I don't want to waste this opportunity. Andy Dutton says, Don, Phil's mentioned already you championed Adrian McKinsey and also Lou Berney. And I should say you have. Lou Berney, Berney, November Road is just an immaculate novel. It's a fantastic piece of work. Who's next up that you know about, Don, that we don't? That's the question from Andy.
There are 2 or 3 people, and I'm not going to bring their names out yet, but I am working on it. Okay. I think it's, and Anthony alluded to this earlier, that it's just a great privilege to be able to help aspiring writers, in this field, as people helped us, and so it's a pleasure. But yeah, I have 2 or 3 people in mind,
and you'll be tweeting about them, I'm sure, once you can.
You bet.
Yeah. And what about you, Anthony? Who are you reading at the moment?
I'm always looking at new manuscripts and new writers and everything, and I have no names to offer you, but I will just add to what Don said there. Again, going back to William Goldman, who said that it was actually the duty of the writer, but the senior writer has a duty and a responsibility to look after other writers. And I've always believed that to be the case. And it's nice now to be the age I am, where I can actually encourage and support younger writers, mention them, tweet their books, and do what I can to support. I mean, the one thing I do have a problem, which is that I now appear, I think, on more book covers than books I've actually written by myself, because I don't know how you deal with that, Don, but, the glowing endorsement, which is, it's so difficult to say no, and I always worry, how many more books can I recommend?
Right.
Do you find that a sort of an issue?
Yeah, it's a bit of an issue. Probably not as much for me as it is for you, but yeah, a little bit.
Well, but I think it is. I like to support people, and I love to share. I love sharing. I mean, I think the greatest thing about reading, all my best books, my favorite books, have been recommended to me. That someone says, you've got to, like your book's done. It was Adam who gave me your book and said, read this. And that's what I love about reading. But it is passing on something so precious, which is the love of a book and the discovery of a writer and the journeys you take when you begin reading. And so doing that for new writers as well as old writers and promoting the books I love is again, it's a great privilege and part of the job.
Yeah, I feel really lucky to be able to do that now,
Phil.
We're looking at you, Phil, expectant.
Yeah, sorry, I think because Don was still talking and then my line just packed up of its own, so that's fine. What I was going to ask you was, and based on the fact that, and I have told you this before, Anthony, but you were the person that got me to read my very first Agatha Christie, is we all have huge to-be-read piles by the side of the bed or the office desk. So how often do you allow yourselves to go back to a classic, given how many new books you have to read? Anthony, do you want to take that first?
I reread 19th century literature all the time. One of the great things about great literature is that every time you read it, it tells you something about yourself and about where you are in life. So, for example, Charles Dickens, I've read Great Expectations. I've read most of his books 2 or 3 times. The Great Expectations I must have read 4 or 5 times over my lifetime. And every time I read it, I feel I learn something new about where I am in my own life. And I think that is what great literature does. So, in fact, I mean, one of the difficulties I have is breaking away from those books that I love and want to reread, because rereading is like visiting an old friend and rediscovering an old friend. And I stop myself from doing it so I can keep reading new material.
Don?
I agree completely. I go back to the classics a lot, in our genre. Part of my quarantine reading is I reread all of Chandler.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've just bought last week a beautiful edition of Chandler, which I got in a secondhand bookshop.
Yeah.
Stacked up in my bed to start in a week or two's time. That's my next reading, to reread Chandler.
Yeah. Or sometimes if I have, 20 minutes or half an hour and I don't feel like doing anything else, I'll just pick up the collected works of Shakespeare, open them at random and read for 20 or 30 minutes, because it's always so beautiful. As Anthony said, it's always reinforming us, you know, because we are different people and we've had different experiences now. We see new things in those passages. I read War and Peace every 5 years, and Huckleberry Finn.
I've never managed to get through it. That's the book that I keep meaning to read. And I just find the early chapters, so many names, so many characters, so many, I keep going, who the hell is this? And I say, God, I've had enough peace. I want some war now, but it doesn't come. And
you'll get to it.
I want to read it.
But Anthony, how it ends is...
I know. There was a fantastic TV version of it many, many years ago on British television with Anthony Hopkins in it.
It was very good. Yeah, I loved it. Yeah.
No, so I sort of know the story, but I've got to read the book.
When you read it every 5 years, Don, is that because you start it? It takes 5 years to finish it and you start again.
No, but it's a good thought, Phil.
Louise in the chat window said, Anthony, when Storm Rider first came out, I worked as library advisor. You were a great hit with young adults. Well done. And we've had actually so many messages from people saying that you've got kids reading. And I mentioned to you last time we spoke, you've got a friend's 12-year-old son reading. And I think you just deserve all the credit we can offer you for writing stories that captivate the imagination of 11, 12-year-olds, which I think is a difficult age for fiction because some of the fantastic Mr. Foxes have gone and you're not quite into the next YA category, are you?
Am I on?
Yeah,
you froze there for a bit, but I'll pick up on the amount of the question I heard, which is that I'm often asked what am I proudest of in all the writing I've done? Which book am I proudest of? And the answer to that has to be Stormbreaker and the Alex Rider series, because it's unusual to straddle both YA fiction and to write adult fiction. But what I find I value most is this idea that accidentally, because it wasn't my intention, I wrote books that got kids reading, because if kids don't read, they won't grow up into the adults who will read Don and me and all the other writers that there are out there. And I think that the idea, especially now that I'm in my 60s, the idea that I have been in the bloodstream of people's lives for all these years, and now they're adults and they've got kids and everything, it gives me a sense of real satisfaction and happiness. And therefore, the YA work I've done matters a lot to me.
Right, listen, we've overrun by 6 minutes as it is, and I feel that any more would be taking the piss. So let's we'll call it a day there. But don't forget some things. These are what you need to remember. If you go to Waterstone's website and you want to buy The Border, which I highly recommend by Don Winslow, and Moonflower Murders, you can pre-order, which I also recommend. I've had the privilege of reading both. Then the code is locked up, lowercase all word, locked up, and you'll get 25% off as a result of attending this session. You need to know that by buying this ticket for Two Crime Writers and a Microphone's online seminar, that you've raised so far £14,000 for food banks, which is phenomenal. And I know that Anthony and Don and I also want to thank Steve Cavanagh and Luca Veste for organising this, for putting it on, it being so amazing, and for inviting us to do it, because I love Don Winslow's work. I think he's taken out a restraining order on me. I love interviewing Anthony as well, and Anthony's books are a must. Every time there's a Horowitz book out, I find out which publisher is, and I pester the publicist to get a copy of that book and to get him on whatever show I'm doing or whatever podcast I'm doing. So this has been an honor and a privilege for me to have time with these two guys, and we just hope that you've enjoyed it as much as we have. And on behalf of everyone at Two Crime Writers and a Microphone, we can all do a collective wave if you want, guys. Just stay safe and look after yourselves, and thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.